안녕하십니까? 이 자리에 참석해 주셔서 감사합니다. 저는 통일연구원의 통일정책연구실장을 맡고 있는 이상신이라고 합니다. 2021 한반도 국제
Korea Institute for National Unification. We will now begin the session sponsored by my institute titled The Peace Process on the Korean Peninsula and a Vision for New Inter-Korean Relations. We are sorry that we could not invite more participants here at the offline event, but we are joined by online participants, and please leave comments for us. The moderator of this session is former Minister of Unification, Professor Kim Hyun-chul. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The title of this session is The Peace Process on the Korean Peninsula and a Vision for New Inter-Korean Relations. As introduced, I'm Kim Hyun-chul and I'll be moderating this session. We have two presenters in this session and we have three discussants. The first presenter is Cho Han-bom. And our second speaker who is joining us online is Dr. Adam Mount, who is a senior fellow at the Federation of American Scientists. And we are joined by three discussants, Professor Koo Kab-woo. He also joins us online. And joining us here is Mr. Lee Soo-hyung from the Institute for National Security Strategy, and from the Korea Institute for National Unification, we are joined by Kim Sang-gi. We will first hear the presentations from the two speakers. I will give our speakers 15 minutes for their presentation. I ask that you keep within your time limit. Dr. Jo?
Is there not a timer in front of us? Okay, I guess we don't have a timer. All right, it's very nice to meet you. This is such a great session. And the Korean Peninsula peace process and North Korean denuclearization negotiations are facing a critical moment. So it's basically related to Shanghai that China is talking about, and it gives me a great honor to be able to speak about this at this session. So it's actually impossible for me to cover everything within 15 minutes, so I will go over it very quickly. So with regards to denuclearization, I believe we need to first of all touch upon four developments. So for example, there is the Inter-Korean negotiations from 1989 to 1992. And then there is the 1990s to 2000s, where there are North Korea-U.S. negotiations represented by the agreed framework. And a vice ministerial meeting was the greatest level meeting that was held during this time. And now there are multilateral talks from the early 2000s to 2010. And that was held in the form of six-party talks, which no longer exists. And starting from 2018, there are bilateral meetings by North Korea and U.S. mediated by the South Korean government. And what's different from the agreed framework time is that the track has changed into a summit meeting. So it's a meeting between the two leaders. So this is the kind of progress that we have made so far. So denuclearization negotiations between North Korea and the U.S. Let's go into that. I believe that North Korea wants to engage in a denuclearization process that it prefers, the way or method that it prefers. So it's a bit different from the voluntary denuclearization as I put in this presentation. But for the U.S., it wants to follow the manual. So for example, go through the steps of declaration, verification, and dismantlement, and inspect everything. So they want to follow the manual. But North Korea actually wants the regime itself to decide how denuclearization will happen. So like the explosion or the blowing up of Punggye and declaration of a moratorium on the nuclear tests, and no one made them North Korea do that. North Korea chose to do so, and it also chose to come to the bilateral summit talks. So North Korea wants to, as I explained earlier, do things in its own way. So there is that clash between U.S. and North Korea in terms of how denuclearization will take place. Former President Trump is receiving a lot of criticism for not making any achievements with regards to denuclearization. Although I don't personally like him, I do believe he had made some significant achievements. There have been negotiation talks, and he normalized the negotiation or talk channel between the two countries with Hanoi Summit and Singapore Summit and the Panmunjom meeting. So within a period of a year, the leaders of the two countries met 3 times. So that really normalized the track. And second, what's really more important is the fact that North Korea showed its willingness to permanently dismantle the Yongbyon nuclear complex. And of course, South Korean government played a role in that as well. Back when there was the Inter-Korean Summit, that part was actually stipulated in the joint statement. For the first time in history, we were able to see North Korea's willingness to denuclearize. And then in February of 2019, in Hanoi, Kim Jong-un hinted at his willingness to dismantle the Yongbyon nuclear complex. And of course, there is still a lot of controversies over to what extent the dismantlement will take place, but nevertheless, we have at least seen North Korea's willingness to dismantle Yongbyon, and that is a progress made by former President Trump. So that went on from 2018 until now. So I know that people are concerned about the resumption of operation of reactors at Yongbyon recently. But getting rid of the fuel rod and reprocessing process actually takes years. So even if the Yongbyon nuclear complex is resuming operations, it's going to take about 2 to 3 years until the plutonium is produced. So I don't know why people are so hyped up about this. And what's really important is that it's going to take 2 to 3 years for the ultimate process to take place at the reactors. So North Korea wants to engage in negotiations with regards to Yongbyon, but Trump was not accepting of that, and Biden is not really willing to respond to that either. So North Korea... So that's what North Korea wants, and we restored the hotline on July 27th between the two Koreas, and that's when the joint military exercise between U.S. and South Korea has already resumed, and North Korea probably knew about that. And so, the joint military exercise is not going to impede North Korea to make progress on denuclearization, but North Korea just wants South Korea and the U.S. to show some sort of sincerity. And because that did not happen, North Korea was just showing that it is slightly irked by resuming operation at Yongbyon. So in his New Year's address this year, we can always return to the spring 3 years ago. And at the plenary session in June, he said he ordered his cadres to prepare for talks. So there's no reason for North Korea to do away with that. I don't think North Korea will try to upset the current situation. Actually, it probably wants to go back to the negotiation table, but by resuming operations at Yongbyon, it kind of wants to resume a favorable or advantageous position. And so, again, the resumption of operation at Yongbyon is North Korea's attempt to engage in negotiations centering on Yongbyon. So we have something called the Armistice Agreement and also a end of war agreement, right? Armistice Agreement can hardly be found in other parts of the world in history. Biden says that the war on Afghanistan is over, but that's what he says. But anyway,
1조가 전쟁 끝났다. 2조가 영토 조항.
Usually,
4조가 배상.
armistice agreements are followed by peace treaties,
한반도 평화 프로세스는 워낙
but the
장기간에 걸치는
peace building process on the Korean Peninsula is so complex and takes us such a long time that for mutual trust to be formed,
상징적인 어떤
we
선언, 정치적 선언으로. 그러니까 종전선언은 아무런 법적 효과가 없습니다.
separate a peace treaty out of that. An armistice agreement actually has no obligation, because, it's two different things when you say, hey, let's get married, and when you actually sign the paper to become legal husbands and wife.
종전선언을 하자는 사람들도 큰 의미를 부여하고 있고 하지 말자는 사람도 큰 의미를 부여하고 있다.
So a lot of people, people are usually split between two, saying that we should declare end of war and we should not declare end of war. But I am of the opinion that we should declare end of war. And as a matter of fact, it's going to take 1 to 2 decades for North Korea to completely denuclearize. Then at what point should we sign a peace treaty or peace agreement? It's difficult to do that because we have to wait for denuclearization 10 to 20 years from now on. So in order to enhance our political engagement at this moment, I believe we need to first of all declare an end of war and then enter into peace agreement later. And we can think of this in a bilateral manner and multilateral manner. So the end of war declaration and the peace agreement would be held between North Korea and the U.S. And of course, the other steps will be taken multilaterally. And I believe that this bilateral step should be taken first before multilateral steps should be taken. A lot of people are critical of this, but the China actually thinks or believes that the denuclearization issue is going to impact China's interest. And at this time, the strategic conflict between the United States and China is being intensified. So can a peace treaty really be signed at a multilateral level at the moment? No. So we have to switch thinking. And so by taking the bilateral step first, it's not going to be a loss for China either. So there is the South Korea, North Korea, U.S., and China. And all these countries are engaged in bilateral diplomatic relations together except North Korea and the U.S. So once they enter into a bilateral diplomatic relations and declare end of war, then we would be able to sign peace treaty, and that's the bilateral method. Of course, we do have the multilateral option, as I said earlier, but anyway, to swiftly build a peace on the Korean Peninsula would be also advantageous to China, I believe. And once peace is established, United Nations resolutions, related resolutions would have to be adopted, for example. And so denuclearization and peace building process would have to go hand in hand. And once the Korean Peninsula is denuclearized, Japan would become nuclear free. So the two parties can also sign related treaties as well. And this would ultimately lead to denuclearization of the Asian region. This might not seem like a big deal, but actually it would change the nuclear strategy of China, Russia, and the United States. So, for example, the mid-range nuclear missiles will have to be pushed back, and nuclear submarines or nuclear warhead-equipped devices and so on would also be discarded to some extent. So it's going to change everything. And Korea Initiative, that's very important. That's a task for South Korea. So at a time when there's lack of trust between the United States and North Korea, South Korea should take the lead in terms of denuclearization. So I believe the Inter-Korean Summit needs to be held at a virtual manner at this moment as soon as possible. And there will be two agendas. One is a humanitarian package, and another is the North Korea-U.S. Denuclearization negotiation. As far as a humanitarian aid package is concerned, it would include the separated family reunion and vaccines and food. But some people might say that, hey, we don't have enough vaccines for ourselves, but about a month later, we will have remaining vaccines to be given to North Korea. And we can also tens of thousands of tons of food to North Korea. And our lesson learned from the past that we need to adopt a from Yongbyon strategy. They say that Yongbyon is old and that it's not a great item for negotiation, but they've never went to North Korea to actually visit Yongbyon. Dr. Hecker, who actually visited Yongbyon, said that's the center of North Korea's nuclear program. And there is actually a statement that made that if Yongbyon was dismantled, it would have reduced North Korea's nuclear capability by 80%. So of course we would have to freeze and also dismantle Yongbyon and the U.S. can lift sanctions and also resume channels with North Korea. And as for South Korea, we can reopen the Kaesong Industrial Complex and the Mount Kumgang tourism and connect railways. So this would be advantageous for all three parties. So as long as Yongbyon is dismantled, it's going to be irreversible once Yongbyon is dismantled. But, as for North Korean sanctions, the U.S. can always lift sanctions and slap sanctions again. So we are actually dealing between something that is irreversible and reversible, but Trump actually rejected that idea. North Korea suggested something irreversible, but Trump rejected it. I believe that's his biggest mistake. Bolton said that Trump is crazy, but I believe he's the one who is crazy. And it was very stupid of Trump not to accept what Kim Jong-un proposed. So, once we go into Yongbyon, everything will become clear. So it produces HEUs and plutoniums, and if if we were to take all of that out of Yongbyon and dismantle everything, only the projectiles and all would be remaining in North Korea. So at least by September or October, I believe we need to have inter-Korean summit virtually. And we need to talk about humanitarian assistance and also North Korea-U.S. denuclearization talks. And we would then be able to create an entrance for small level talks between North Korea and the U.S. So I believe this would be the best scenario for us. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor. So Professor Cho talked about a long-term denuclearization process, and that in that regard we need to make an active use of the peace-building process, especially regarding the peace regime, U.S. and North Korea, as well as the inter-Korean approach. These two bilateral approaches are very important and meaningful. And two Koreas would have to take active lead to resolve this issue, and therefore humanitarian assistance and the importance of North Korea-U.S. talks and adoption of from Yongbyon strategy would be three keys in solving this pending problem. Next, we would like to hear from Mr. Adam Mount.
Thank you. It's a great privilege for me to be with you virtually. I regret that I can't be there in person to join your meeting. I hope to in future installments. And thanks very much for the organizers and for Kinu for inviting me to this panel. I unfortunately had to choose between speaking with you directly or you being able to see my slides. And so I prefer to be able to speak with you. And hopefully my slides will be available to you in another format. I was asked to speak on the topic of bilateral cooperations for improved relations with North Korea. And I think that's a really nice way of framing our current challenge. And I'd like to explain why I think that. So let me start by describing the status of the nuclear issue, as I understand it currently. And then we'll look at the implications of the nuclear status for defense policy and then for overall policy. So unfortunately, diplomacy with North Korea has so far failed to prevent North Korea from acquiring nuclear weapons. It failed to keep North Korea from testing a nuclear weapon, from miniaturizing and weaponizing their arsenal. And now I think we're going through an additional window. In 2018, it appeared that there was this narrow window to confront Kim Jong-un with an important choice. Was he willing to accept a rudimentary arsenal, one that was small, unreliable, homogeneous, postured for retaliation? Would that be an acceptable end state for him? I think the Trump administration had an opportunity to present him with that choice. Today, the Biden administration officials now acknowledge that North Korea is unlikely to fully dismantle its arsenal in the foreseeable future. And in fact, that arsenal is now expanding and diversifying rapidly. They're building new warheads, new delivery vehicles, more advanced missiles, a greater variety of delivery vehicles, and possibly now they're opening this new role for a tactical nuclear capability, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. So to me, it's now clear that we will pass through this window where we could have confined North Korea to a rudimentary arsenal, or we could have imposed general numerical limits on that arsenal. The United States and South Korea, thankfully, have adopted the only reasonable approach so far, to seek limited agreements to attenuate the threat that we face from North Korea. So it proved implausible and unsuccessful to hold out for the perfect deal, to wait for an agreement that fully dismantled North Korea's nuclear weapons program, to ship North Korea's nuclear warheads to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and dismantle them by Christmas 2018. That was never going to be possible. And now, thankfully, the government in Seoul and our government in Washington agree that what we're looking for is a limited agreement that's focused on the threat in the near-term future. And so let me describe the implications of this fact for defense policy. A strong, stable, coordinated defense policy is necessary to build the foundations for a sustainable policy that improves relations with North Korea over the coming years. So defense and deterrence is really a cornerstone, not only of US-South Korea cooperation, but of our approach to North Korea, as long as they maintain nuclear weapons and advanced conventional weapons and a range of other threats that they face South Korea, Japan, the United States, and other partners and allies. This is becoming a more difficult task. It's not as easy as it used to be. Our alliance needs a top-to-bottom review of deterrence posture to account for these new developments in North Korea's capabilities, to account for North Korean tactical nuclear options, and especially for maneuvering, penetrating strike options. So these are short-range missiles that are capable of striking targets on the peninsula at short notice that can probably penetrate US and South Korea joint missile defense systems. And so they've got an option for conventional or nuclear strikes in small numbers at short notice against critical targets. Both of these developments require adjustment from the United States and South Korea. In recent years, I'm sorry to say that at sometimes we've sort of let our deterrence posture drift. So we've been worried about joint diplomatic policy. We've been worried about the challenge from China. We've been worried about exercises. We've been worried about burden sharing agreements, and all of these are important issues. But our deterrence posture has not kept pace with how rapidly North Korea is evolving. There are a number of challenges that we need to put on the agenda. We should review our missile defense plans. We should review our counter-provocation strategy. We should review our policy on decapitating the North Korean regime. So possibly carrying out strikes against North Korean leadership, which is something that the South Korean military, and to a lesser extent the United States military, has talked about publicly. Each of these are understood as cornerstones of our deterrence posture. But as North Korea is expanding its arsenal rapidly, we need to take a hard look at what we're hoping to accomplish with these challenges. We need to not push North Korea into a position where it feels like nuclear use is its only option. We need to recognize that stability should be the guiding principle for US and South Korean joint deterrence posture. In some ways, this is a really difficult thing to say, and it's a really difficult argument to make. We don't accept North Korea as a nuclear weapons power, and we never should. And they're certainly not on the level of the United States in terms of our strength and nuclear capability. And increasingly, South Korea now possesses a stronger conventional capability than North Korea. So they're in no way a peer. And yet, as they've gained this nuclear capability, we now have a joint interest with North Korea in preventing a nuclear conflict on the peninsula and further abroad. Our strategy should prioritize conventional defense, conventional deterrence, and assurance between the United States and South Korea with conventional forces. We can't trust that the US nuclear umbrella is a get out of jail free card. We can't trust the US extended deterrence commitment, though it remains strong and it remains capable. We cannot trust that capability to deter every possible act of aggression that North Korea should make. And we cannot pretend that that nuclear weapons are the only signal of US commitment to South Korean security. Our conventional forces work together every day. They have an extremely strong capability to stand shoulder to shoulder to defend South Korean territory against any act of aggression, right? Whether it's from sea, at sea, in the air, limited missile strikes, increasingly cyber capabilities. We need the ability to defend South Korean assets and capabilities, not just threaten to retaliate for them. So stability is a goal that is sometimes difficult to talk about, but I believe the correct one. And for more on this perspective, you can see an article that I wrote in Survival with Mira Rapp-Hooper at the beginning of last year. It's important to recognize that while deterrence is a cornerstone of our policy, it's not a permanent answer. Deterrence buys time for us to solve the problem. It buys time for us to develop a more stable, more sustainable relationship with North Korea that transforms North Korea in a way that they no longer pose such an exigent threat to our joint security. The next thing to say about defense policy is that defense policy should support our diplomatic policy. So we need to ensure that as we are modernizing our systems, as we are signaling to North Korea that this broader effort to develop an effective overall policy towards North Korea is not inhibited or infringed or undermined by our defense policy. Our arms control objectives should be to proactively generate compelling proposals to limit the most threatening systems that North Korea has. So in this, I believe that we should set aside symbolic initiatives, whether they're military or diplomatic, that are focused on achieving a public relations win. They're a good talking point. They're a good photo op. Those pale in comparison to the importance of doing a limited agreement to limit and address the most threatening systems that North Korea is developing. So our diplomacy should always be focused on tangible benefits to improve our security in the near term. That means nuclear and conventional arms control, first and foremost. I agree with Professor Cho that Yongbyon is an important signal, and that is an option that the Trump administration should have pursued more fully. I think it's an overstatement to say that 80% of North Korea's nuclear capability resides there, but it's an important installation in particular for controlling North Korea's plutonium route, which is important as they want to develop potentially lower yield, smaller, more weaponized, more capable, more efficient warheads. So if we can address the Yongbyon complex, I think that's hugely helpful. But I don't necessarily think it should be our first priority. The first priority should be reducing the threat from North Korea. This requires trilateral coordination with the United States, South Korea, and Japan to really agree on what our priorities are, but it's important that we do it. Moving to overall policy. The important thing to recognize is that our allied strategy that we currently hold is no longer sufficient to secure our interests against a wide range of North Korean challenges. No matter how successful we are at updating our deterrence and diplomatic posture, coming up with new potential agreements, making new recommendations to North Korea, developing new systems to deter North Korea, no matter how effective we are at that, it cannot keep pace with the runaway North Korean arsenal that is expanding and diversifying without limits. We need instead a bilateral strategy to transform our relations with North Korea and to shape the transformation of North Korea itself. So to shape the regime's internal evolution in ways that incentivize it to hold a stable policy towards the region and towards its neighbors. This requires more regular diplomatic and economic contact to identify opportunities and increase our leverage over North Korea's evolution. Unfortunately, our current leverage over North Korea is virtually nil. We have almost no influence on North Korea's military posture, the shape of its nuclear policy and doctrine, the rights and welfare of its citizens and workers, its economic policy, its educational policy, its gender policy. We have almost no ability to influence that right now. So more regularized contacts are important here. I think it's important that we recognize that doesn't mean necessarily normalizing relations. Every contact that we have with North Korea, every economic project that we undertake with North Korea should be conditional and managed extremely closely. They should be directed at decreasing the salience of the KPA in North Korea's economy and increasing the political leverage of a class of traders and entrepreneurs in North Korea that have an interest in a stable relationship between North Korea and the rest of the region. Each and every policy should be, in each and every interaction, should be assessed by the yardstick of whether it improves our relationship with North Korea in a way that does not help the regime consolidate its internal control, repress or impoverish its citizens, or indeed contribute to weapons proliferation or other damaging activities. And so I'd note in this regard, a couple of years ago, a dozen experts from the United States, South Korea, Japan, Europe, Canada, US, and allied countries, we attempted to develop one of these sustainable overall policies towards North Korea that in particular laid out a plan for multilateral management of potential economic projects with North Korea that was based on strict conditions to ensure that it met all of our joint objectives and agreements. So 2 very quick points. This requires, again, very close coordination and frank coordination between the United States and South Korea to be clear about what our objectives are and whether our acts of outreach meet those objectives. Second, we should not allow China policy to detract from the need to maintain an effective North Korea policy. Right now, all Washington is seized by this competition with China. It's an important issue. It certainly bears on the North Korea issue, but neither our military posture nor our political priorities should detract from the attention that we pay to North Korea, which, let's be clear, remains a threat to its neighbors, remains a threat to the citizens of North Korea and has a potential to destabilize relations and affect US and South Korean interests across the board. So it's an issue that we need to remain focused on, even as there are other issues on the bilateral agenda. Thanks very much.
예, 고맙습니다.
Thank you very much. You raised some very important points. You talked about how our allied strategy is no longer sufficient, and you talked about the need for more than just deterrence and diplomacy. You talked about how we need more regular contact to induce changes in North Korea. And you also talked about how we should also focus on a conventional deterrence instead of just focusing on nuclear extended deterrence. And I think that you also wanted to mention the importance of the confidence building between the two militaries of the two Koreas. And you also mentioned that how the China policy should not detract from the North Korea policies. And I think that some of the points you raised will be food for thought for our discussion, which we will begin now. And I will now give 7 to 8 minutes to each of our discussants. Our first discussant to speak is Professor Kukabu.
예, 고맙습니다.
Thank you.
두분 발표
So I enjoyed the two presentations,
질문 코멘트.
and I have several questions and comments.
첫 번째는
So first
로마 목사님
is to Professor Cho and perhaps to Mr. Mount as well. So you talked about your ideas of denuclearization and
프로세스에 어떻게 영향을 미치게 될지.
how will how do you think Korea's politics shape the denuclearization in the future? So, and Mr. Cho, you talked about some initiatives, and I would like to know if they are actually feasible. And also, I would like to talk about the politics in the U.S. So the policies of the Biden administration and the recent Afghanistan events and so on
미국의 대북 정책을
are
전략적 인내 2.0
shaping its North Korean policy in a way that is a strategic patience 2.0 version. So I wonder what you think about that.
그리고 그 이시적인 몇 가지 문제에 대한 질문인데
And there are
다발적 비핵화라는 약간이
And Mr. Cho, you talked about the voluntary denuclearization of North Korea or doing it in its own way. But what really is the definition of denuclearization? In your presentation, it was kind of unclear for me. So can you clarify? Because the term denuclearization itself is something that is used only on the Korean Peninsula. So it would be very important for us to clearly define what denuclearization actually means. And I think maybe the reason why U.S.-North Korea talks were broken off is because there was no clear definition of what that term means. So, Professor Cho, can you elaborate? And with regards to North Korea's voluntary denuclearization, even if we make progress on that, there is still the problem of verification remaining. And personally, in terms of peace building on the Korean Peninsula, perhaps we could get South Korea also involved in verifying the dismantlement process. And in the North Korea-U.S. summit, there were two things that were missing. If we look at Bolton's memoir and related documents, there is the end of war declaration problem and also the U.S. South Korea joint military drills issue. And listening to your presentation, Mr. Cho, So we need to resolve the security dilemma on the Korean Peninsula, which is represented by that joint military drill. And maybe with regards to denuclearization issue, this is something that we also need to resolve critically, because there is that mentioning of a autonomous security based on alliance, but if that is emphasized, the security dilemma on the Korean Peninsula will not be resolved, but instead become intensified. And that would negatively impact the peace process on the Korean Peninsula, I believe. So can you elaborate, Dr. Cho? And with regards to end of war declaration, so many researchers on international law in the United States say an end of war declaration is actually, armistice agreement is de facto end of war. So we don't need to necessarily have end of war declaration to become the entrance of denuclearization talks. Some people are of that opinion. So, and you mentioned about the effectiveness of bilateral end of war declaration, but in a time where there is a strategic conflict between U.S. and China, perhaps a multilateral approach would be more effective, I believe. So can you comment on that as well, Dr. Cho? And with regards to mid to long-range missile problems that were mentioned in Bolton's memoir, and that was what Bolton wanted, actually. And with regards to that, mid to short-range missiles. And I think Japan has the biggest concern when it comes to North Korea's mid to short-range missiles. So if you look at the 2018 peace process in Korean Peninsula, Japan actually tries to disturb that process. But I don't think you touched upon Japan's role, the positive role that it can play in the peace process on the Korean Peninsula. So perhaps you could give us your input on that as well. And with U.S.-China conflict, North Korea, I think, has opted for self-reliance or self-rehabilitation. I think we could make various interpretations on this, but this means that in the denuclearization process, China has to play an active role. It has to be a key actor. So we probably need to make more considerations about the role of China to play in the denuclearization process. And if I look at the end of the presentation, there is the process of peace building mentioned, and you talk about the transition to a peaceful use of North Korea's nuclear program. But do you think we would be able to get agreement by the U.S. and Korea for that? Because Korea is trying to phase away from atomic energy at the moment. So, making a transition into making a peaceful use of North Korea's nuclear energy might be contradicting that.
I have a question also for Dr. Mount. I think we are in the process of actually recognizing North Korea as a de facto nuclear state. So, based on that, we are pursuing denuclearization. So we are pursuing denuclearization as we are recognizing that it is a de facto nuclear state. And you were talking about how we need to shape North Korea's change internally. But I agree with that. But I think in order to do that, the U.S. has to change its three aspects of its policy. In order to resolve I think the U.S. needs to propose policies to resolve the security dilemma, and it needs to normalize its relations with North Korea. And thirdly, economically, of course, North Korea is bearing the brunt of the UN sanctions, but it is also has U.S. sanctions. I believe that the U.S., when it actively promotes or helps or supports North Korea to join the IMF or the World Bank, then we can see some meaningful change from North Korea.
Thank you. So many questions were raised, and I would like the presenters to respond to those questions. But first of all, Mr. Lee Soo-young, can you make your remark? Thank you for the wonderful presentations.
In March 1993, North Korea withdrew from the NPT, and from that point on, the nuclear issue has been a dilemma for 28 years. And from 2018 April, from the Panmunjom Declaration to the breakdown of talks in Hanoi, the recent stalemate has been ongoing for 30 months. Resolving the North Korean nuclear threats entails 4 components. First is the surgical strike. This is a military strike. And this is an impossible option. So if we eliminate this option, the second option is strong UN and U.S. sanctions. The option is to maintain these sanctions and applying pressure to induce a regime collapse both directly and indirectly. And the third option is negotiations, both on and off. And the fourth option is a de facto arms disarmament. Of course, the Biden administration is talking about coordinated and pragmatic approaches. But there is, of course, people who say that it is a strategic patience 2.0. And I think the Biden administration is currently going back and forth between sanctions and negotiations. North Korea, I think, believes that there is still a window for negotiations. And this is because North Korea has not explicitly shown its ICBM and SLBM capabilities. The vagueness of policies of the U.S. administration, if the U.S. administration continues to be vague about its North Korea policies, then the North, I believe, can go ahead with an ICBM or SLBM test in the future. I have a question for Dr. Mount. The current alliance strategy when it comes to deterrence, you talked about the need for that. I believe the South Korean government's North Korea policy depends greatly on the U.S.'s extended deterrence. And it also relies on our own deterrence against North Korea. So those are the two foundations. And on top of that, South Korea is relying on diplomacy and negotiations processes. I'm sure that you already know, but there is talk of a NATO-type system or a reallocation of assets. But for Korea, the talk of these options is coming as a great burden. And we do not feel that it is helpful to South Korea's North Korea policies. In your opinion, do you feel, you said that the extended deterrence is not enough at this point, and so I would like you to further elaborate on your position regarding that the extended deterrence is insufficient. And you also said that the China policy should not detract from the North Korea's policy. But if you look at the U.S. from a military security perspective, it's almost impossible to distinguish from the U.S. How the U.S. is responding to the U.S.-China competition and how it is responding to North Korea. And sometimes it's hard to tell if the U.S. is solely pursuing North Korea policies to resolve this issue, or if it's using the North Korea policy in some ways in its China policy. And you were also talking about how we need to induce change in the regime in North Korea stably. But how would that specifically look like? Would we need to acknowledge the legitimacy of Kim Jong-un's leadership? Would that entail lifting some of U.S. sanctions? Do you mean that the U.S. should engage in more engagement policies with North Korea? So these are some of my questions for Dr. Mount.
Now we would like to ask Mr. Kim Sang-gi to make his remarks. Hi, I'm from the Korea Institute for National Unification, and my name is Kim Sang-gi. So I enjoyed the presentations of Dr. Cho and Dr. Mount. And I also enjoyed the comments made by the two other discussants. So, with regards to recent political landscape on the Korean Peninsula, I would like to talk about a few things and some items of consideration. So, the recent political landscape on the Korean Peninsula, in the short term, it's not going to be easy to improve inter-Korean relations and North Korea-U.S. relations. So things are not looking optimistic in the short term. So after the Hanoi summit broke off, the stalemate has continued for the past 2.5 years. So it's been protracted, and which raises concerns. And this year, when the Biden administration was launched in February, and it announced its review on North Korean policy in April, and it proposed talks to North Korea, but North Korea has not yet responded. And the South Korean government is also continuing to make proposal for talks and exchanges to North Korea, but North Korea also has not responded. So recently, as you all know already, the hotlines between the two Koreas have resumed. So we did see some positive changes, but not long after that, in August, there was a joint military U.S.-Korea exercise, and the communication channel was cut off once again, and North Korea's Kim Yo-jong and Kim Yong-chol made statements against South Korea and the U.S. that it will make corresponding measures against the joint military drills. So that's the current situation. And as Professor Koo mentioned earlier, so the domestic landscape in the United States is not so positive when it comes to resolving the denuclearization issue. For example, like COVID-19 is spreading greatly again. There are, for example, more than 100,000 confirmed cases daily in the U.S. And another thing, with regards to the Afghanistan issue, the Biden administration is greatly cornered. And the support rating for Biden administration is falling greatly at this moment. And against this backdrop, for the Biden administration to focus on North Korea is not so easy. Well, that is my perception. So overall, the peace process on the Korean Peninsula of course, should be resumed, but the surrounding environments are not so favorable. But amidst this situation, we ought to play our given roles, the due roles. So some items of important consideration are as follows. First of all, to maintain stability on the Korean Peninsula, we need to manage the surrounding situation. That's very urgent. North Korea has already declared that it will take corresponding measures against the joint military exercise held in August. We don't know how that countermeasure will take place, in what form. It's very difficult to predict, but since North Korea has made official statements about it, it will take place. The joint military drills has been over now for a few days already, and going forward in September and until October, there can be any kind of retaliatory measures taken by North Korea. The possibility still lies ahead. But, once we go over November and into winter, there's the Beijing Olympics. So I don't think North Korea would be able to take actions to raise tensions on the Korean Peninsula. But before that, between September to October, I believe North Korea can take some provocative measures. And so we need to think about some response measures for that. And with respect to that, so we have to urge North Korea not to take any actions to raise tensions on the Korean Peninsula. And at the same time, South Korea and also the United States should refrain from behaviors or words that might provoke North Korea. So if we are to refrain ourselves from provoking each other, I believe that's going to be the beginning of building trust. And second, so it is to my understanding that talks are going on between South Korea and the United States about providing humanitarian assistance to North Korea. And I believe this kind of assistance is necessary and that it could contribute to trust building. However, rather than connecting them to any political or military issues, the assistance and support should be made unconditionally. That's a very important key point. So the assistance is not given to get something back. So these assistances should be unconditional. And with regards to nuclear issue, North Korea is most interested in the alleviation of sanctions. So I think we need to deliver some messages regarding relief of sanctions, especially the United States. After the Biden administration came to office, we did see some of its reviews of North Korean policy, but there has been no clear messages from the new U.S. administration with regards to its willingness to lift sanctions. So before denuclearization talks are resumed, sanctions relief might have to be extended to foster exchange and cooperation. And once the talks are resumed, and at the initial stage, if we could once again actively carry out some sanctions. Of course, and when going into the negotiations and at the initial stage, we will send out a more active messages about the possibility of relieving sanctions. So an active issuance of messages with regards to sanctions relief is direly needed. And lastly, I believe this might be the most important thing, and it's related to sanctions. North Korea has a clear stance on the U.S. and South Korea. It's very consistent. So during the recent Party Congress, it declared openly that it has some certain conditions to improve relations with South Korea and the United States. With regards to South Korea, North Korea wants the joint military exercise to be suspended. And with regards to the United States, it should withdraw hostile policies against North Korea. Those are the preconditions set by North Korea. So if these issues are not resolved, I believe we will keep facing obstacles. So South Korea and the United States, one way or another, should take these proposals into consideration and take related actions. That's going to be key in discussing the enhancement of inter-Korean relations and U.S.-North Korea relations. So those are my thoughts. And I think I would like to conclude, but I actually had some questions, but Professor Koo already asked multiple questions already, and some of them overlapped with my own questions. But just if I were to repeat one question once again, Mr. Mount, you talked about the enhancement of exchanges with North Korea, how important that could be, and especially economic cooperation, and I agree with you. However, for that to actually take place, it's closely linked to the sanctions issue. So how can we realize such economic cooperation when there are sanctions still in place? Can you give us your comment on that?
So we heard from the three discussants, and they have asked many questions. If we had more time, I think we would be able to have a very lively discussion. But we do not have that much time, so I would like to ask the presenters to keep in mind the time limit. We are joined by online participants, as I mentioned earlier, and we are joined by many, and they have been asking questions on the chat window. So again, participants online, if you have questions, if you ask the questions, we will make the time to ask them for you. Currently, we have 3 questions, and 2 questions are for Dr. Mount. The first question is, the U.S. has deployed or is trying to deploy MD systems in Korea and Japan. Do you feel that this is a sufficient strategy? And second, the defense costs have risen both in the U.S. and South Korea. Do you think that that will act as a deterrent against North Korea? Do you think that the rise in defense cost will trigger instability in the broader Northeast Asian region? And there was also a question for me, the moderator. North Korea has restarted the Yongbyon facility since July. What do you think its true intentions are? That was the question for me. We do not have a lot of time, as I mentioned earlier. I will turn the mic over to the presenters for about 7 to 8 minutes to respond to the questions and comments first. Dr. Cho.
So thank you for the comments, especially Professor Koo. Thank you, because I think he read my presentation materials very thoroughly. He gave me a lot of questions, and thank you very much. But I think perhaps you raised these questions to find some solutions and answers to your own questions that you had when you were trying to research and solve this issue. But anyway, for North Korea, is currently facing many problems that it cannot solve on its own. And for South Korea, the next presidential election is going to be very interesting. It's going to be a great black hole, I believe. And with regards to domestic situation in the United States, it's very complex. But I don't think the Afghanistan issue is going to become a variable, because it's not a failed war. I mean, the withdrawal process was a bit complex, but the key issues have been resolved, and therefore U.S. has some room for diplomacy and security activities going forward. But the problem is, so rather than domestic issue, the Biden administration said that its North Korean approach will be practical and calculated approach. And I thought that was going to be version 2.0 of strategic patience. And I think it's really happening at this moment. But then there's no other choice for the current U.S. administration right now. Because like if a child is throwing a tantrum saying, I want to buy this toy, and if the parent does not buy the toy, the tantrum is not going to end. The child does not have any intention to make things excruciating for the parent, but the child just wants the toy. So I think we can kind of look at the current situation with that metaphor. And if we miss this point in time, things could really get messy because North Korea is facing great difficulties at the moment because that child, if he doesn't get the toy, could run away from home. And now, North Korea wants a selective or voluntary denuclearization method, whereas U.S. wants a manual type denuclearization method. So with regards to voluntary denuclearization method, will North Korea truly denuclearize voluntarily? I don't think so. Because if we go into the head of Kim Jong-un, so the reason why North Korea developed nuclear weapons is because there is a big gap between North and South Korea. And there is the South Korea-U.S. alliance that made that gap even bigger. And to resist against that, North Korea had no other options than to create nuclear capabilities. So it's for its survival. And that's how they were able to create social solidarity within the regime. But then, would North Korea really be able to give up its nuclear program entirely by having faith in South Korea and the United States? I don't think Kim Jong-un would do that. So for us to expect voluntary denuclearization doesn't make sense. So not voluntary denuclearization, but forced denuclearization is the term that we should use. And there are two ways to do forced denuclearization. One, we need to do something that Kim Jong-un would fear. All dictators are afraid of regime instability. But then causing regime instability in North Korea could cause instability on the Korean Peninsula. That's a negative enforcement. But a positive enforcement is for us to give a big incentive to Kim Jong-un, something that will be very appealing to Kim Jong-un. But if we look at the Biden administration, it does not have both. It has neither. It just claims, sanctions. So totalitarian governments actually become collapsed through internal instability. They do not become collapsed due to sanctions. So that's the given reality at the moment. So there's no negative incentive and there's no positive enforcement either. But the clock is ticking. So forced denuclearization is but then actually very dangerous because it concerns us, South Korea, as well. So I believe positive enforcement, positive incentive is very important. But without that, for us to say, North Korea, let's meet, we will give you humanitarian assistance, that's not going to work because that's not what North Korea wants. Humanitarian assistance is not what North Korea wants. So right now, we need to think about what that positive enforcement could be. And I believe one way of that could be the from Yongbyon type strategy, the from Yongbyon proposal, starting from that. And North Korea has pressurized South Korea and the U.S. by reoperating Yongbyon and create tactical nuclear capabilities against South Korea and the U.S. But its ultimate goal is to engage in talks, I believe. So we don't know what the exit will be for denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. Maybe we won't ever know what the exit is for a long period of time. So for us right now, we shouldn't focus on the exit, but to focus on creating an entrance. So we have to create an irreversible entrance. So we're not creating a door, but we're actually, ripping the door out to create a hole for us to go in there. Once we are able to dismantle Yongbyon, plutonium, uranium, and tritite, all these three materials will not be able to be created. And U.S., China, France, UK, and China all are based on hydrogen nuclear capability. But right now, North Korea only has HEU. Its program is only HEU based. So if we dismantle Yongbyon, a large part of its nuclear program would be eradicated. So we have to create an entrance focusing on Yongbyon. So I have three phases, the three stages in my presentation: the entrance stage, core stage, and residual stage. And right now we need to focus on making the entrance stage to go into core stage swiftly. So if the politics on the Korean Peninsula and the U.S. becomes even more complex in the future, North Korea will take actions to enhance or make its position more advantageous at the negotiation table. So the time has come for us to turn this crisis into an opportunity. And I know this is going to be a difficult task, but South Korean government would have to play an active part. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mount. You have the mic.
Thank you. It's very rare to field so many perceptive and thought-provoking questions. I regret that I won't be able to engage with all of them. I hope folks will stay in touch and we can talk through this more. I agree regretfully with many of my colleagues when they say that the Biden administration's approach is vague. Strategic patience 2.0 is sort of difficult to quantify because strategic patience was so difficult to quantify. Unfortunately, I think it's accurate to say the Biden administration is hoping to see an opportunity crop up with North Korea. And if they did, they would be ready to seize it. I think there are very principled, extremely capable, very pragmatic officials that President Biden has appointed on East Asia, on Korea in particular, and on national security more generally. I think if that opportunity presents itself, they'll be ready to seize it to the fullest. That having been said, I do not think that they've yet articulated a strategy to develop that opportunity, to really open that window with North Korea that they could jump through. I wish that there had been more attention paid on the issue, and I wish that the strategy review had been more pointed, more deliberate, more public, more articulate. Mr. Lee, so many good and constructive points. I regret that I can't address them all, but I did want to touch on your topic about extended nuclear deterrence. My view is that Allied deterrence strategy, as it currently stands, has not been fully updated and fully adjusted to North Korea's current evolution. We need a considerable review there. That doesn't necessarily mean that U.S. extended deterrence credibility is insufficient. I think the United States is extremely committed to South Korean security. Our soldiers fight shoulder to shoulder. We're ready and willing to engage in that fight together. Our nuclear capabilities remain safe, secure, effective. That having been said, what I do believe is that we have undervalued and underprioritized conventional deterrence and conventional capabilities. I agree that South Korean requests for new signs of U.S. extended nuclear deterrence commitments. So nuclear signals, nuclear sharing agreements, redeployment of tactical nuclear weapons, NATO-like dual key arrangements. I think it's right to say that all of those are a burden. all of those detract from the critical challenge that we have ahead of us, which is how to defend South Korean territory with conventional forces, how to deter nuclear use, how to deter aggression. Our conventional capabilities, in my view, are the strongest signal of assurance that the United States can send, and they're the primary forces that are ready and able to confront North Korea. We should not be distracted with these exotic sort of nuclear proposals, which are extremely unlikely to happen. And if they did, my view is it would seriously harm South Korean security and position in the region. So we should set those aside and prioritize the real challenge ahead of us. Mr. Kim, again, so many great points. One thing jumped out at me that I wanted to also underscore. I agree with you wholeheartedly that so long as we can assure that humanitarian aid gets to their intended recipients, the civilians of North Korea, and is not expropriated by the regime to increase their bottom line, we should provide humanitarian aid unconditionally, as much and as often as they are willing to take. The reason is a healthy, educated, stable, capable North Korean populace is very much in our interest. We should not be complicit in helping the Kim Jong-un regime repress and impoverish its own people. They use hunger, repression, discrimination as a tool to support their destabilizing policy, and it provides them opportunities to behave in irresponsible ways. It also harms the North Korean people, which is morally reprehensible. So I agree with you. As much as they're willing to take, we should be willing to provide, provided it gets to we can be sure that it gets to the right source. And I also wanted to discuss directly on the two questions that were received online, both of which were quite good. Is missile defense a sufficient deterrent against North Korea? The United States and South Korea have decided that missile defense is an important component of our deterrence posture. That's not going to change. Within the alliance, in our deterrence posture, and as a political imperative in the United States, people think very, very highly of missile defense. But I do not think it's a sufficient deterrence and defense mechanism. Let's think seriously about what, and more precisely, about what missile defense is for, because too often we consider it in the abstract. What's missile defense good for? Well, it can't necessarily prevent an all-out attack against North Korea, against South Korea. It probably can't even, with complete certainty, prevent a North Korean attack against the United States. They have too many missiles that can saturate our missile defense capabilities. Increasingly, missile defenses are incapable at preventing or denying North Korea the ability to strike at South Korea with small numbers of limited strikes against military or civilian targets. So they have the ability to saturate our missile defenses and increasingly to evade our missile defenses with maneuvering reentry vehicles and missile capabilities. So the question is, what are missile defenses for? Well, I think you can make an argument that they still play a role in terms of theater missile defense, but I think it's clear that they're becoming increasingly more tenuous and that we cannot depend on them for our security. This is what happens when you get into a deterrence relationship with another country that has nuclear weapons. They have the ability to damage the United States and South Korea, and we need to behave accordingly. That's why stability is the goal here. Lastly, do rising defense costs deter in and of themselves? I don't think so. I think that we've purchased a number of capabilities, especially South Korea has purchased a number of very effective capabilities that can exercise deterrent leverage. But what's important is our posture. Are we communicating the right kinds of threats? Is our posture stabilizing? Does it antagonize China? Are we going to be capable and ready in a conflict? I think these are the critical questions more than how much does it cost. And and these are what we should be focused on. I think you're exactly right to say that we need to be careful not to trigger regional instability. This is one way that we need to be cautious that our China policy does not inadvertently destabilize the balance on the Korean Peninsula, but also doesn't put South Korea in a worse position in terms of an escalating US-China conflict, in terms of an inadvertent conflict on or around the peninsula. We don't want to make South Korea a target. That's not in the United States' interest. And it's critically important that we review US, South Korean, Japanese capabilities for long-range conventional strike to make sure that it doesn't force or drive, drive is a better word than force. It doesn't drive either Beijing or Pyongyang to adopt destabilizing practices themselves.
예, 고맙습니다. 혹시
Thank you. Among the discussants, perhaps you have some other things to say? Mr. Lee, okay, I'll give you some 2 to 3 minutes, and Mr. Koo, I'll give you 2 to 3 minutes as well.
Thank you very much for your response, Dr. Mount. I'm not sure if I heard correctly. Currently, the South Korean government, you talked about how it is demanding for more nuclear deterrence or diverse nuclear deterrence from the U.S. I would like to correct you on this. That has been on the part of some opposition party leaders. Currently, I think there is high credibility regarding the U.S. Nuclear deterrence. So those demands that you mentioned were made by some opposition leaders. And as I mentioned earlier, South Korea is pursuing its North Korea policy based on diplomacy, which is rooted in confidence in the U.S. nuclear deterrence as well as Korea's deterrence capabilities.
And with regards to what Professor Cho had said, so when it comes to our approach towards the North Korean nuclear program, it's rather ambiguous. But North Korea actually is facing greater difficulties with regards to COVID-19 than sanctions at the moment. And if this situation is prolonged at a time when the US-China conflict is rising, North Korea, regardless of what its intention might be, would lean greatly on China even more than before. And of course, North Korea has relied on China to date, but it has made sure that it did not cross the red line. But because the COVID situation is so severe, it might be willing to cross the red line. And therefore, we need to take that into consideration when we shape our North Korean policy and to make visible decisions. So, taking use of an opportunity to come up with some practical measures actually kind of sounds a bit negative to me. And it is of my opinion that the Biden administration still remains rather passive in its policy towards North Korea. Professor Koo, would you like to also say something? Well, I don't have a lot of comments to say, but Dr. Cho, perhaps you could respond to some of my questions that I mentioned earlier. Well, actually, you asked a lot of questions, and we do not have much time left for us, so it would be very difficult to address them all. So North Korea did not develop its nuclear program for the past 30 years for humanitarian assistance. It could be a priming water. Assistance can be a priming water. But, North Korea is not going to respond to that. We can't just beat around the bush expecting North Korea to come to the negotiation table. So let's go back to the essentials, what the core or key is. Okay. So we don't have a lot of time. I'm sorry.
1분만.
Just 1 minute, please. Just 1 minute.
정 박사님 지적 굉장히 중요하다고 보는데
So I believe that comment was very important.
파워 프로세스를
So
다시 설계하고자
if we want to redesign our denuclearization process,
딜레마를 해소하는 방안이 먼저 제기돼야 되는 거
we will have to first come up with a plan to resolve the security dilemma in the region. If I look in your presentation, that part is missing. I'm sorry, but once again, we do not have much time, so perhaps a further discussion on the presentation materials would be able to be answered at another time. We wish more time was given to us, but I'm sure other materials that Mr. Cho has written today might be able to answer some of your questions as well. And given this short amount of time left, I have a short question to Ms. Dr. Mount.
지금 대체로 우리가 토론한다면 바이든 정부에서
The Biden administration, when it comes to negotiations or North Korea policy, it seems that many people feel that it's no longer a priority for the U.S. Of course, there's the COVID pandemic and the strategic competition between the U.S. and China, and this seems to be taking interest away from the North Korea issue. And recently, with the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan, it seems Washington is preoccupied with that part of the world, and there is some discussion or controversy, if you will, a policy debate between the Democrats and the Republicans in Washington. Do you think, how do you think these situations will take away or add to the focus and concentration on North Korea policies generally?
Minister Cho, thank you for your question. This is something that I've heard quite a bit of. This administration, as I say, has appointed expert officials in a range of positions that have responsibility over North Korea and national security more generally. It can walk and chew gum at the same time. I do not believe that Afghanistan and the withdrawal there would negatively impact our ability to carry out diplomacy with North Korea or to develop a strategy with North Korea if the Biden administration had one that it was prepared to implement. So, as I say, if the opportunity presents itself and if the North Koreans prove willing to engage in diplomacy, I believe this administration will be ready, willing, and capable to pursue that opening to the greatest extent possible. I think that this administration is ready and raring to go in that regard. I would like to close because I didn't get to address Professor Ku's comments in enough detail previously with his comments about resolving the security dilemma, because I think that's a poignant phrase. As a political scientist, we're taught that it's not possible to resolve a security dilemma. A security dilemma is always there. And there will always be this potential for tension when both sides have military forces. I think that's true. I think we will be living with a militarized and threatening North Korea for the foreseeable future. The challenge is to work out how we can develop a stable balance and a relationship that is not inimical and dangerous, that it doesn't provoke destabilizing crises year to year, and that the nuclear threat is not at the front and foremost of our interactions day to day. That requires transforming our relationship with North Korea. It requires North Korea to pick up the phone, and it requires us to be ready and willing to pursue that opening if and when it comes. And I hope we can. Thanks for the discussion today.
예, 고맙습니다. 이제 마무리해야 될 시간이 됐는데요. 저한테
I think we need to wrap up, and there was a question for me as well. And it was about the intentions behind the restarting of the Yongbyon nuclear facilities. When we analyze North Korea's behavior, that we actually have to take into consideration three factors. The first is the technological side, and then the demand for negotiation, and the third is the situation within the domestic situation. In many cases, we focus on the need for negotiations, and then we try to analyze the motive behind certain moves. At the Yongbyon facility, they produce nuclear materials, and sometimes they can diversify delivery mechanisms. And so I think perhaps we need to analyze the demand for technology on the part of North Korea. There is a context to the North's certain moves. There is probably a process of technological advancement in North Korea, and that is why we need to take a look at Yongbyon first and foremost. And of course, implementing that, we will be influenced by political situations and other factors. As you know, the negotiations are at a stalemate, and the stalemate is quite protracted. And this can serve as motive and need for the North to push ahead for nuclear development. And within that context, North Korea's move, I think, was predictable. And we also need to take into consideration the domestic side of things. North Korea is facing great difficulties because of the sanctions and also the COVID pandemic. And nuclear armament is an accomplishment that can be promoted within North Korea. So if you take into the three factors into consideration together, we can understand and interpret North Korea's move, and it helps us predict and project what North Korea perhaps will do in the future. And today we engaged in discussion concerning a number of issues, and I think that we came across many challenges. There was also talk of whether we need to pursue denuclearization, or do we need to acknowledge North Korea as a nuclear state and come up with a new way to respond to North Korea's threats. So we looked at many different aspects of this issue. I think what is important is whatever option we choose, whatever direction we choose, we should never waver in our commitment to overcome the situation. If we simply acknowledge the situation and give up, then we will never be able to find a solution. And in the denuclearization, we talked a lot about Yongbyon when we were talking about denuclearization. It is an important piece of the puzzle when it comes to denuclearization. We could explain this using the kingpin theory. So perhaps Yongbyon can become the engine and the force, the deciding force behind the denuclearization process. And I think that that is where we can find value in the Yongbyon facility. I think we found a lot of common ground as well among our panelists and discussants. The focus has to be on relationships rather than deterrence when it comes to policies. That was an opinion that was raised. At the end of the day, building trust and building a strong relation will contribute to the content and the speed of negotiations when that day comes. That was one of the thoughts that was raised. Thank you very much. I think we need to wrap up. I wish we had more time, but I'm sure we will have many more opportunities to deal and talk about this issue in the future. I would like to thank our panelists and our discussants for taking part in this session. Thank you.
예, 감사합니다. 오랜 시간 수고해 주셨습니다.
Thank you so much for engaging in the talks. I would like to express my appreciation to our moderator, Mr. Kim Yeon-chul, and the presenters and discussants. That concludes the session titled The Peace Process on the Korean Peninsula and a Vision for New Inter-Korean Relations. Thank you.